Elizabeth Elliot, in her book, The Liberty of Obedience, I've never read that. She's an author I love, but I've never read that book. She tells of a young man, a new follower of Christ, who sought advice on how he should live to please God. Here's what he was told. Give up colored clothes. Get rid of everything in your wardrobe that's not white. Give up your soft pillow. Sorry, all you at home, you have to give up your pillow. Sell your musical instruments. Stop eating white bread. You cannot, if you are sincere about obeying Christ, take warm baths. And you cannot shave your beard. To shave is to stand against who God made you. It's an attempt to improve on His work. Interesting rules to draw near to God, isn't it? Elizabeth Elliot asked, does this sound a little bit absurd? It is the answer given in a celebrated Christian school of the 2nd century. A celebrated Christian school of the 2nd century. It's possible, she says, that the rules we have adopted in the 20th, when she wrote the book, now the 21st century, is it possible that they will sound as absurd to followers of Christ in centuries ahead? Is it? We probably think not. But consider this. I dated a girl when I was in college who was not allowed to play cards. Now, I thought that was kind of weird. She actually attended a church that was part of their statement when they joined the church, that they wouldn't do certain things, and one of those was play cards. I was weaned on a deck of cards. I mean, my family, that's our get-together. We love to play games, and we play a lot of cards, and I couldn't imagine that they would say you can't play cards. And so the funny part of that story is she said, we can play rook, though. And I said, what is rook? I'd never heard of it. And basically, it's a deck of cards that uses colors instead of shapes. And so I'm like, well, okay, whatever. That seemed like a silly rule to me. There was one church in the northern U.S. that fired their pastor for ice skating to church one Sunday. In the northern U.S., when it was extremely cold and the church was on the river, as was his house, and he couldn't get there because his vehicles broke down, he put on his ice skates, skated to the church, and was there for Sunday morning. That church didn't allow ice skating on Sunday. They fired him. Some absurd rules that are in this century. I've heard of churches, not this century, but last century, that used to use beaners in the balcony. You know what a beaner is? You'll love this. Kathy and Connor upstairs. Connor isn't here, but Kathy's up there. Somebody would sit in the balcony with a long straw and beans, and if they saw anybody falling asleep or misbehaving, they would shoot a bean at them. Now, can you imagine that during a long sermon? You're just kind of, I mean, yeah. Now that we've all laughed, I want you to know that in Nicholas County, West Virginia, clergy members may not tell jokes or humorous stories during a church service on Sunday. I'm in big trouble. So, in the book, Elizabeth Elliot calls on us to examine more closely our own obedience to God. She says we should measure it in terms of our experience of His freedom and grace and love. But often we measure our obedience, and unfortunately the obedience of others, by human standards of behavior in a way that our actions define us. But you know what? In the true religion of Jesus, heart attitudes are the important thing. Heart attitudes are the important thing. The religion of man says this, action over attitude. But the religion of Jesus says heart attitudes are the basis for our actions. The religion of man says it's all about how we behave. The religion of Jesus says it's all about our hearts. We've been doing a study comparing the religion of men to the religion of Jesus. And this is a study in the last part of the book of Matthew. And it began when Jesus asked his disciples, "Who do you say that I am?" And the response was, "You are the Christ. You are the Son of the living God." And Jesus made this interesting comment. He said, "That was not revealed to you by men, but by God." And then Jesus starts to tell his disciples, okay, you believe I'm the Christ. Let me tell you why the Christ really came. He came to die. That's why the Christ came. And Peter pulls Jesus aside and he says, God forbid that would happen to you. That's not going to happen. And Jesus' comment was, you're thinking like a man. You aren't thinking the thoughts of God. And from that point on, there's story after story after story in the book of Matthew where the human mindset is revealed in contrast to the godly mindset, the religion of men in contrast to the religion of God. And we've seen that the religion of men is about fairness, but the religion of God is about unmerited favor. We've seen that the religion of men is about status, but the religion of God is about service. And we will see today that the religion of God, men is about action, but the religion of God is about the heart attitude behind it. You see, the religion of man has it all backwards. Where we see that is in a story still in Matthew chapter 20, right near the end of the chapter, beginning in verse 29. Let me tell you the background to this story. Jesus is traveling to Jerusalem to die. He's told his disciples 4 times, 3 in no uncertain terms, and probably a 4th time, that the reason he's going to Jerusalem is to die. He keeps telling his disciples, and they just don't get it. They haven't quite got that point yet. They keep proving by their questions and actions that they don't get it. You put this on a calendar, it's about 1 week before Passover. Now, Passover is one of the big holidays of the Jews. They have 3 big holidays during the year when they actually are, a lot of them travel to Jerusalem to celebrate that holiday, and Passover is one of those big holidays. And just like in our world, there's a lot of people on the road right before a holiday. And so there are a lot of people traveling to Jerusalem, and Jesus is traveling, and because Jesus drew a crowd, there were a lot of people traveling with him. So there was quite a large crowd of people. The roads are full, and they come to Jerusalem. Come to Jericho. I'm sorry, say the wrong thing. They come to Jericho, and that's where this story picks up. They come into Jericho, and as they were going out of the town, by the way, that's when the story hits, but Jericho is a major city on a major road. It's a very warm climate. It's a road that connected the 2 main north and south roads of the Roman Empire in this area. It was an east and west road that connected them. It went from Jerusalem down into Jericho, a very common road. And because of that, it was a great center of business, so it was a very busy place, and probably a very popular place for beggars. By the way, Zacchaeus, another famous character from the New Testament, the short little tax collector, he was from Jericho. And so he was a part of that busyness that was there. And as they're leaving the city, Matthew says, they are met by 2 blind beggars, Jesus and his company. And these men hear that it's Jesus, and they begin to cry out to Jesus. Now, they're beggars. They're probably crying out to everybody. But this would mean they were crying out even louder because they heard who was going by. And when Jesus hears them, he calls them to himself and he heals them. Listen to the entire story. Matthew chapter 20, beginning in verse 29. And as they went out of Jericho, a great crowd followed him. And behold, there were 2 blind men sitting by the roadside. And when they heard that Jesus was passing by, they cried out, "Lord, have mercy on us, Son of David." The crowd rebuked them, telling them to be silent. But they cried out all the more, "Lord, have mercy on us, Son of David." And stopping, Jesus called them, and he said, "What do you want me to do for you?" They said to him, "Lord, let our eyes be opened." And Jesus, in pity, touched their eyes, and immediately they recovered their sight. And they followed him. Now, before we get into the lessons of that story, I want to talk about some potential contradictions, because this is a favorite story of those who say the Bible is full of contradictions. Because of some of the differences between this version and the versions in Mark and Luke, because Mark and Luke have some significant differences to this story. For instance, you could ask the question, were they coming or going? Jesus said as they were leaving Jericho, or as they went out of Jericho, Mark and Luke both say as they drew near to Jericho. And so those who point out contradictions says, well, which was it? Were they entering the city or leaving the city? Well, there's two possible explanations of that both make a lot of sense. One of those is that the most common explanation is that there were really two Jerichos, because there's the ancient city, and you remember that's the city Joshua marched around and watched the walls collapse centuries before this. Joshua pronounced a curse on anybody that would rebuild the city of Jericho, and it was never rebuilt. It was still there in ruins. In fact, people say you can still see the ruins today, but just a mile up the road, they started a new city and called it Jericho. So it could very easily be the case that Jesus was leaving the old city and entering the new city when this happened. And that would be an easy explanation. Another explanation, which makes sense with this story as well, is that Jesus met these men, these blind men, as they were coming into Jericho. And because these men kept crying out, they were following the crowd, crying while the crowd was trying to quiet them. And as they got to the other side of the city, Jesus stopped, and that's when he healed them. And both of those are perfectly compatible with both stories that you read, and there really is no contradiction. Another question that comes up is how many blind men were there? If you read Luke and Mark, you'll see it says there was a blind man calling out. But that's easy to figure out the differences in that, because if there are two men and one of them is the chief spokesman, he's the one doing all the crying out, it's easy to tell the story about the one, and the other could be there all along. And so Mark even names the man, he calls him Bartimaeus. He was probably the outspoken one, but if he's the outspoken one and there were two, there's no contradictions between the stories whatsoever, because it doesn't say there was one blind man, it said there was a blind man. You know, if we were sitting in a crowd at a football game, we could say there was a fan in my area shouting obscenities, and they hauled him off because he was so rude. You know what? There was probably hundreds of people in your section shouting obscenities, but there was one that was prominent, and that's the one they hauled off. And so that's not a contradiction. It's just a different way of telling the story. So really there are no contradictions between what Matthew tells us and what Mark and Luke tell us in these stories. But now I want you to notice two things. I just lost it again. That happened last week. I want you to notice two things. I want you to notice the crowd, and then I want you to notice the blind men. First of all, notice the crowd. They expected a certain behavior from these men. They had a proper way of doing things. They had a certain protocol that was supposed to be followed. They had their club rules. Their protocol meant that beggars and poor people and handicapped people didn't speak up in public. That was the protocol. That was their club rules. Beggars, poor people, handicapped people didn't speak up in public. They especially wouldn't be allowed to disrupt a famous person, a celebrity, as Jesus was, or a famous rabbi, as Jesus was at this time. Man-made religion is often about expectations that are put on people, expected actions that are put on people. Those expectations often lead to a legalistic point of view. A legalism that says everybody has to act like this. And legalism isn't true religion, it's man-made religion. And so they had a certain expected behavior, and they were uncomfortable with nonconformity to that behavior. When people didn't conform to their club rules, they got uncomfortable with this, and these guys didn't fit the rules. You know, handicapped people don't speak up in a crowd. Beggars don't speak out in a big crowd when a celebrity's walking by, and yet that's what these guys were doing. Man-made rules like that, those kinds of expectations, often lead to discomfort, which leads to harshness. And that's what was happening in this story. They were harsh, the crowd was harsh with these men and told them to be quiet because they were uncomfortable with them. There was an article a few years ago in a magazine called Pulpit Helps it was named this: Lists Make for Minimalist Religion. List makes Lists make for minimalist religion. I'm having trouble saying that one. This is what the article said. People who make lists of all the wrong things that you can do miss the whole point of Christianity. People like to think that they've got the list worked out. They comfort themselves in thinking that their list is better than anybody else's list. But then there's no desire for true righteousness beyond a list. You see, if we have a list of club rules of a certain protocol, then we think we can measure up to that, but that's not true religion at all. That's the religion of men. I've told you a little bit about this story before. Phil Vischer was the man who founded VeggieTales and invented all the characters in VeggieTales, was the voice for many of them. Phil Vischer lost all the rights to VeggieTale characters in a bankruptcy and a lawsuit. And this is what he said after that. He said, after the bankruptcy, I looked back at the previous 10 years and I realized I'd spent 10 years trying to convince kids to behave Christianly without teaching them Christianity. Wow. He said, that was a pretty serious conviction. You can say, hey kids, be more forgiving because the Bible says so. Or you can say, hey kids, be more kind because the Bible says so. But that isn't Christianity, it's morality. You see, what he realized that he had been teaching all those years was correct action without teaching the heart attitude that should be behind it. And that was a conviction in his life. That's what the crowd was doing. Here's the rules, here's the protocol, stick to it. But I want you to notice the blind men because they're really the positive example of true religion in this story. So I want you to notice them. First of all, I want you to notice that they cried out to Jesus. They cried out to Jesus. They were probably always crying for donations because that's why they were sitting on a busy roadside. But now, as I said, they were probably crying out even louder than before because they became, as far as the crowd was concerned, obnoxious. But you see, they recognized their own helplessness. And that's where true religion starts. It starts with us recognizing our helplessness. That's why Jesus said, blessed are the poor in spirit, because that's where true religion starts. And that's where these men started. They knew they were helpless, and they called out to Jesus. Number two, I want you to notice that they knew who Jesus was. They knew who Jesus was. Check out what they said. Lord, have mercy on us, Son of David. They called him Lord, which could be the New Testament equivalent to the Old Testament name Yahweh, but more than likely what they're just saying is master or boss. They recognized either way that Jesus had authority, that he was a man of great authority. And then they called him Son of David. In their culture, that was a title for the coming Messiah. He would be called the Son of David. And they recognized that Jesus was the Messiah who was promised to come. Not only does Jesus have authority, but they believed he was the one who had the authority to help them. And then they say, have mercy on us. They not only recognize their need, they know that Jesus is the one who can meet that need. And so they beg of him his mercy. So they knew who Jesus was. Because of that, they believed that Jesus could heal them. That's number three. They believed that Jesus could heal them. It might be number 4 in some of your notes. I don't know. I had it backwards in one place. Jesus came up and he said, what do you want? And they didn't ask for money. They didn't even say, well, if you can't do that, some money will help. They just asked for one thing. They said, Lord, let our eyes be opened. They may not have had a full picture of who Jesus was, but they knew enough to call out to him, and they did that. They acted in faith, in the faith of who they knew that Jesus was, what they knew about him. They called out in that faith. They believed that he could and that he would heal them. They were calling out to Jesus and to Jesus alone. Max Lucado, in his book, It's Not About Me, which is a great book, this is what he said. Legalism is the theology